The night my sister came back into my life. She was already dying on my operating table. I didn't recognize her face at first. Blood has a way of erasing everything familiar, turning people into something unrecognizable, something distant. But when the nurse read her name out loud, Emily Rhodes, something inside my chest tightened so suddenly I had to grab the edge of the bed just to steady myself. 10 years. 10 years since I had heard that name without anger attached to it. 10 years since my parents chose her version of the truth and erased me like I had never existed. And now she was here. Broken. Unconscious. Bleeding out. Doctor. Brooks. We're losing her. The words snapped me back into place. My hands moved before my mind could catch up. Pressure. Clamp. Suction. Commands came out of my mouth steady and precise. Like muscle memory was doing all the thinking for me. Because the cruelest part wasn't that my sister was dying. It was that I was the only one who could save her. And just outside those doors, my parents were waiting. They had no idea the doctor standing over her was the daughter they abandoned. Not yet. I leaned in closer, forcing my focus back where it belonged. The monitors were unstable, her pulse erratic under my fingertips. There was too much blood. Too fast. The room narrowed into controlled chaos. Nurses moving quickly. Metal instruments clinking. The steady hum of machines trying to keep her alive. Prep for OR, I said, my voice firm, leaving no room for hesitation. We're not waiting. I had done this hundreds of times. Trauma cases didn't scare me anymore. Not the blood. Not the urgency. Not even the possibility of losing someone. But this was different. Because no matter how hard I tried to separate the patient from the past, I couldn't unhear her name. I couldn't unsee the girl she used to be. The girl who stood in our living room 10 years ago and watched everything I had fall apart. Doctor, do you know the patient? The question came from one of the nurses. Quick and casual. But it landed heavier than it should have. No. I answered immediately. Too fast. I didn't look at her. I couldn't. Let's move, I added, sharper this time, pushing the moment aside. Emily's condition dipped again, a sharp drop in blood pressure. The monitor let out a warning that cut straight through the room. Internal bleeds worse than we thought. Someone said, I know, I replied. We fix it now or we lose her. There was no time left for hesitation. Not here. Not now. But as they rushed to prepare for surgery, a different kind of pressure crept in, one I hadn't felt in years. Her family's already here, a nurse added quietly. They're asking for an update. Family. The word hit harder than it should have. For a fraction of a second, I froze. Then I nodded. I'll talk to them. I stepped out into the hallway, the bright lights of the ER suddenly feeling harsher than before. My gloves were still stained. My scrubs marked with the reality of what was happening inside that room. And there they were, older than I remembered. Smaller somehow. My mother clung to my father's arm like she was holding on to the last thing keeping her upright. His posture was stiff, controlled, like he was trying to stay strong for both of them. For a moment, they didn't recognize me. Why would they? I had changed everything. My name, my life. The person I used to be. But then my mother looked at me, really looked. And something flickered. Is she going to live? She asked. Her voice trembling in a way I had never heard before. I didn't answer right away. 10 years ago? They didn't wait for my answer. Now? They had no choice. Her condition is critical, I said finally. My voice calm. Detached. Professional. We're taking her into surgery immediately. My father nodded, but he didn't meet my eyes. Some things, it seemed, hadn't changed. My mother, though, she kept staring, as if she was searching for something she couldn't quite place. I turned to go, already pulling my mask back into place, ready to step into the only role I allowed myself to have in moments like this. But just before I reached the doors, I heard it. A sharp intake of breath. Then my mother's hand tightened around my father's so hard he flinched. That voice, she whispered. I didn't stop. I walked back into the operating room. The sound of the machines swallowing me whole again. But this time, my heart wasn't steady anymore. Because I wasn't just stepping in as a doctor. I was stepping back into a story I never got to finish. And this time, I wasn't the one being silenced. The first time my life fell apart. It didn't happen in a hospital. It happened in my parents' living room. Under warm yellow lights and the smell of dinner still hanging in the air like everything was normal. It wasn't. Back then, we were still in Charleston. The house was always spotless, always quiet, always controlled. My parents liked things that way. Order meant respect. Respect meant everything. Emily was sitting across from me at the table, smiling the way she always did when she knew everyone was watching her. Effortless. Charming. Safe. I used to think that meant she was stronger than me. I was wrong. "Can you pass the salt?" she asked lightly. Like nothing in the world had ever gone wrong for her. I handed it over without a word. My father was talking about the business again. His voice steady. Proud? The Rhodes Consulting Group had grown fast that year. New clients. Bigger contracts. More money. Everything looked perfect from the outside. But I had been going through the internal audit reports for weeks. And I knew something didn't add up. "Dad," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. "There's something in the client accounts I think we should look at." The room shifted almost immediately. Not dramatically. Just enough. My father paused. My mother glanced at Emily. And Emily, she didn't look surprised. "What do you mean?" my father asked. "There are discrepancies," I said. "Transfers that don't match the reporting logs. It could be a mistake. But it's probably just a formatting issue." Emily cut in quickly, her voice smooth. "You know how messy those systems can get." I looked at her. "Too quick. Too easy." "I checked more than once," I said. "It's not just formatting." My father's expression tightened slightly. Not angry. "Just impatient?" "Natalie," he said. "We've been running this company for 20 years. I think we know how to read our own reports." There it was. Dismissed. Again. "I'm just saying we should double-check," I replied. "That's all." Emily smiled softly, tilting her head like she was trying to help me. "I think you're overthinking it," she said. "You've been working too hard." My mother nodded. "You do tend to worry too much." I pressed my lips together, feeling that familiar frustration rise in my chest. It wasn't just that they disagreed with me. It was that they never really listened. Dinner moved on like nothing had happened. My father went back to talking about expansion plans. My mother asked Emily about an upcoming event. The conversation flowed around me like I wasn't even there. But I couldn't let it go. Because I knew what I saw. And more importantly, I knew Emily knew it too. Later that night, I stayed up going through the files again. Numbers. Timestamps. Account movements. Patterns started forming the more I looked. Money was missing. Not a mistake. Not random. Intentional. I was about to print everything out when I heard footsteps behind me. Emily. She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching me. "You're still on that?" she asked. I didn't look up. "Yes." She stepped closer. "You really think something's wrong?" "I know something's wrong," I said. Silence stretched between us. Then she laughed softly. "You should be careful. Natalie." That made me stop. I looked at her. "What does that mean?" She shrugged. "Casual. Just saying, accusing people of things like that, it can backfire." "I'm not accusing anyone," I said slowly. "I'm trying to figure out what's happening." Her eyes held mine for a second longer than they should have. Then she smiled again. "Good luck with that," she said, and walked away. I didn't understand it then. Not fully. But something about that moment stayed with me. The next day, everything exploded. I was called into the living room. My parents were already there. Emily stood beside them, her face pale, eyes red like she had been crying. My stomach dropped before anyone even said a word. "What's going on?" I asked. My father didn't answer immediately. He just looked at me, not with confusion, but with something colder. "Emily told us everything," he said. "Everything." The word hit like a slap. "What are you talking about?" "She said you've been altering the reports," my mother said, her voice shaking. "Moving money between accounts." "That's not true," I said instantly. Emily let out a soft, broken sound. "I didn't want to say anything," she whispered. "But I couldn't keep covering for you." "Covering for me?" I stared at her. "You're lying." Her face crumpled like I had just hurt her. "Why would I lie?" she asked, tears spilling over. "You're my sister." I stepped forward. "Because you know something's wrong and you're trying to hide it." My father's expression hardened. "Enough. I have proof," I said quickly. "I can show you." "We've seen enough." He cut me off. "No, you haven't," I insisted. "You're not even listening." "We trusted you," he said, his voice low and final. And just like that, it was over. My words didn't matter. My evidence didn't matter. Nothing I said mattered. I looked at my mother, hoping just once she would question it. She didn't. She just held Emily closer. Like I was the threat. Like I was the one who had broken everything. And in that moment, I understood. It wasn't about the truth. It was about who they were willing to believe. And it wasn't me. The monitor screamed before anyone said a word. "Pressure's dropping." I was already moving. "Push fluids. Now. Get me another unit ready," I snapped, my voice cutting clean through the noise as my hands pressed down. Steady and firm. There was no room for hesitation here. No room for memory. But her name was still there. Still echoing. Emily Rhodes. It sat in my chest like something unfinished. Something that had been waiting 10 years for this exact moment to come back and demand an answer. "Doctor, we're losing output." "I see it," I said sharply. "Clamp here?" "No." "Tighter. Hold it." "Hold it." The room moved with me. Fast. Efficient. Controlled. This was where I lived now. Not in the past. Not in that house in Charleston. Not in the version of myself who begged to be heard. Here. I was in control. And yet, something wasn't right. I glanced at the chart again between movements, scanning details the way I always did, quickly, instinctively. The injuries didn't match. They told us it was a fall, internal trauma from impact. But the pattern was off. Too scattered in some places, too precise in others. And there were markers in her blood work that didn't sit right either. "Run a full tox screen," I said. A resident hesitated beside me. "Doctor." "Protocol, usually." "I know protocol." I cut in, not raising my voice, but leaving no room for argument. "Run it." He nodded quickly and moved. Because in this room, what I said mattered. That thought hit me harder than it should have. 10 years ago, I couldn't get a single person to listen to me. Now, a room full of professionals moved on my word alone. Funny how that worked. Vitals unstable. A nurse called out. "I've got it," I said, adjusting my position. "Stay with me. Stay with me." The words slipped out before I could stop them. I didn't use names in here. It made things messy. Personal. But tonight, everything was already personal. We stabilized her for the moment. Not safe. Not even close. But not gone. "Prep for transfer," I ordered. "We're not done yet." As the team moved, I stepped back just enough to breathe. Just enough to think, something about this didn't fit. And I had learned a long time ago, when things don't fit, there's a reason. I washed my hands quickly, the water running cold over my skin, grounding me. The noise of the ER faded just slightly as I focused. What if this wasn't just an accident? The thought came quietly, calm, logical. And once it was there, it didn't leave. I walked back out toward the nurse's station, pulling up her records again. History, medications, recent visits, patterns. I always looked for patterns. There, A prescription filled under a slightly altered name. Not enough to trigger a flag unless you were really paying attention. Another one. 2 months earlier. Same type of medication class. Unusual for someone her age. Her health profile? Who admitted her? I asked. Paramedics, the nurse said. Husband called it in. Husband. I didn't react outwardly. Is he here? She nodded toward the waiting area. Hasn't left. I followed her gaze. He stood near the far wall. Phone in hand. Posture straight. Not pacing. Not frantic. Just waiting. Too still. Grief had a rhythm to it. Panic had a sound. I had seen both more times than I could count. This wasn't either. He looked up. Our eyes met for a brief second. And something shifted. Not surprise. Recognition. It was subtle. Quick enough that someone else might have missed it. I didn't. He lowered his phone slowly. Watching me now. Measuring. I held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Then I turned away. Back to the chart. Back to the facts. But my mind was already connecting something else. 10 years ago, I had seen that look before. Not in him. In someone else? Standing at the top of the stairs. Silent. Observing. Uncle Daniel. The memory hit fast and sharp. I shook it off immediately. No, that was different. Different time. Different situation. Wasn't it? Doctor. I blinked. Refocusing? Yes. Do you want toxicology notified now or after confirmation? I looked down at the numbers again. The inconsistencies. The quiet signals no one else seemed to be paying attention to. Then I looked back toward the waiting area. He was still there. Still watching. Notify them now, I said. The nurse nodded and moved. I exhaled slowly. 10 years ago, I had tried to point out something that didn't make sense. No one listened. This time, I wasn't asking anyone to believe me. I was going to prove it. Behind me, the alarm sounded again. Doctor, she's crashing. I didn't hesitate. I moved. Because whatever this was, whatever had been done, she wasn't dying before I found out the truth. Scalpel. The word came out steady, even though everything inside me felt anything but. The surgical lights washed the room in harsh white, turning skin pale, blood darker, every movement sharper. I leaned over Emily's body, focused, precise, cutting exactly where I needed to. This was where I was supposed to disappear into the work. No past, no history, no emotion, just the patient, just the procedure. But tonight, that line didn't hold. Retractor, I said, and someone placed it in my hand immediately. We opened further, exposing the damage beneath. The room tightened around us. The quiet intensity of people who knew exactly how fragile this moment was. Blood pressure's still unstable, a nurse said. I see it, I replied. I always saw it. And right now, I was seeing something else. Something wrong. The internal bleeding was real. Severe. But the pattern didn't match what I would expect from a fall. Not clean. Not consistent. There were signs of stress in the surrounding tissue that didn't come from sudden impact. Hold that, I said, adjusting the angle. No, don't move. Keep it right there. I leaned in closer. Bruising. But not just from trauma. Something deeper. Something that had been building. Run the tox panel as soon as those labs come back, I added without looking up. Already in process, the resident said. Good. Because the more I looked, the less I believed this was an accident. We controlled one bleed. Then another opened. Clamp. Got it. Pressure here. Yes. Doctor. The room moved with me. No hesitation. No questioning. 10 years ago, I couldn't get a single person to hear me out. Now, no one questioned a single word I said. The irony wasn't lost on me. Vitals dipping again. Push-uppy. Seconds stretched thin as the medication went in. I watched the monitor, waiting for the response. Come on. Her heart rate flickered. then climbed. Barely, but enough. Stay with me, I muttered under my breath. I wasn't sure if I meant it for her or for myself. A nurse stepped closer, handing me a sheet. Preliminary labs, she said quietly. I glanced down quickly and froze. Not visibly. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But inside, everything went still. Trace compounds. Uncommon. Not something you saw in accidental cases. Not something you saw unless someone had been putting it there. Slowly. Over time, I handed the paper back without a word. Continue, I said. My voice as controlled as ever. But the thought had already taken root. This wasn't random. This was intentional. We moved through the procedure, closing one issue only to uncover another. Her body had been under strain long before tonight. It showed in ways only someone trained to look would catch. Medication history, I asked. The resident pulled it up quickly. Nothing unusual on record. Check again, I said. He hesitated for half a second, then nodded and looked deeper. Moments later, he spoke again. There are a few prescriptions. Different providers. Slight variations in name spelling. There it was. Not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to hide. Print it. I said, yes. Doctor? My jaw tightened just slightly. Someone had been careful. Very careful. And suddenly, this didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. Doctor, another nurse said quietly, stepping closer. Her husband is asking to speak with you. Says it's urgent. Of course he was. I didn't look up. Tell him I'm busy saving his wife. A pause. Then, yes. Doctor, I kept working. If he had something to say, he could wait. I had waited 10 years. Another complication hit. Heart rate dropping. Stay on it. I snapped. Don't lose that line. Everything sharpened again. Faster. Tighter. No room for distraction now. I moved with precision, blocking everything else out. Past. Questions. Doubt. Just this. Just keeping her alive. Come on, I murmured again. Quieter this time. Her name almost slipped out. I stopped it. Barely. Minutes stretched into something longer. Heavier. The kind of time that only exists inside an operating room when everything is on the edge. And then, slowly, her vitals stabilized. Not safe, but holding. We've got her, someone said, relief slipping into their voice. I didn't respond. Not yet. I stepped back slightly, eyes still on her, watching every line on the monitor like it might change its mind at any second. She was still here, still breathing, still alive, and if she lived, she might be the only one who could explain everything. I looked down at her face again. Different now. Not just my sister. Not just the person who destroyed my life. Something else. Something caught in the middle of something bigger than either of us. 10 years ago, her words had ended everything for me. Now, her silence might expose everything. And for the first time since she came through those doors, I didn't see her as the enemy. I saw her as a piece of the truth I never got. The doors to the operating room opened, and for a moment, everything went quiet. Not the hospital, not the machines. Just inside me, I stepped out, pulling off my gloves, the faint smell of antiseptic clinging to my skin. The hallway lights felt harsher now, too bright, too exposed. And they were still there, exactly where I had left them. My parents. My mother's eyes locked onto me immediately. Searching. Desperate. My father stood straighter, like he was bracing himself for whatever I was about to say. This time, they didn't look past me. This time, they looked at me. Really looked. Natalie, my mother whispered. The name hung in the air between us. For a second, I said nothing. I let it sit there. Let it settle. Let them feel what it was like to wait. 10 years ago, they hadn't given me that chance. It's Dr. Brooks, I said finally, my voice calm, even leaving no room for anything personal. The shift was immediate. My mother flinched. Like the correction hurt more than the distance ever could. My father's jaw tightened, confusion flickering behind his eyes before he forced it down. My mother started, her voice breaking. Is Emily going to be okay? I held her gaze. Steady and unreadable. She's critical, I said. We stabilized her. But she's not out of danger. No comfort. No reassurance. Just facts. My father nodded slowly, absorbing the words, but still not fully meeting my eyes. Some habits didn't change easily. My mother, though, she couldn't look away. It was like she was trying to memorize me. Like she was afraid I might disappear again if she blinked. I didn't give her anything to hold on to. Movement behind them pulled my attention. A man stepped forward, adjusting his jacket like he was walking into a meeting instead of standing outside an emergency room. Daniel Carter, he said, extending his hand. Emily's husband. I looked at his hand, then at him. I know who you are, I said, not taking it. The smallest shift crossed his face. Gone in a second. But it was there. Recognition. Not surprise. Something else. He lowered his hand slowly. Recovering. Then you know how important it is that I understand what's happening. His voice was controlled. Measured. Practiced. Not panicked. Not afraid. I had seen real fear. Real desperation. This wasn't it. We're doing everything we can, I replied, keeping my tone clinical. That's not what I asked, he said, a hint of pressure slipping through now. I want to know her chances. I studied him for a second. Too composed. Too careful. She's alive, I said. That's all that matters right now. It wasn't the answer he wanted. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened just slightly, the way his fingers flexed at his side before he stilled them. Then I added, we're running additional tests. That got his attention. What kind of tests? He asked. Toxicology. Full panel. There it was. The crack. Small. Quick. But unmistakable. For half a second, he lost control. Is that really necessary? He said. Too fast. I took a step closer, lowering my voice just enough that it didn't carry beyond the three of them. Yes, I said. It is. Our eyes locked. And in that moment, it wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a line being drawn. Behind him, my parents looked between us. Confusion building? What do you mean toxicology? My father asked. They said it was an accident. I didn't look at him. Not yet. Something doesn't add up, I said. My mother's hand tightened around his arm again, her knuckles whitening. Is there something wrong? She asked, her voice barely holding together. I turned to her then, really looked at her. At the fear, the uncertainty, the way she was finally asking a question she should have asked 10 years ago. Is there something we don't know? She whispered. I held her gaze. Let the silence stretch. Let it press in. Yes, I said. One word. That was all it took. Behind her, Daniel shifted. Subtle. Controlled. But I saw it. He knew. Or at least, he knew enough to be worried. We should focus on Emily right now, he said quickly, stepping in again. Trying to redirect. Speculation isn't helpful. Speculation. I almost smiled. I'm not speculating, I said. I turned slightly. Just enough that my attention settled fully on him now. I'm observing. His expression didn't change. But something underneath it did. Something tighter. Something sharper. My father stepped forward, his voice firmer now. If there's something going on, we deserve to know. Deserve? The word echoed in my head. 10 years ago, I had deserved to be heard. That hadn't mattered then. I looked at him. Really looked. At the man who had decided I wasn't worth believing. At the man who had watched me walk out and never stopped me. You'll know, I said quietly. Not warm. Not cold. Just certain. Then I turned away. Because I wasn't having this conversation in a hallway. Not like before. Not where they could interrupt. Not where they could shut it down. This time, they were going to hear everything. And they weren't going to be able to ignore it. The ICU was quieter than the operating room. But it felt heavier. Machines hummed in steady rhythm. Monitors blinked in soft pulses of light. Everything here moved slower. More controlled. But the tension didn't go away. It settled. Emily lay in the bed. Pale. Fragile. Surrounded by wires and tubing that kept her connected to a world she almost didn't make it back to. I stood at the foot of the bed for a moment before stepping closer. Alive. Barely. But alive. A nurse approached quietly, handing me a report. Toxicology just came back. I took it without a word. My eyes moved quickly over the results, then stopped. There it was. Clear. Confirmed. Trace amounts of a slow-acting toxin. Not enough to kill instantly. Not enough to draw immediate suspicion. But enough to weaken someone over time. Enough to make an accident far more likely to be fatal. I exhaled slowly. So I had been right. This wasn't a mistake. This was planned. Do we notify administration? The nurse asked carefully. I didn't answer right away, because I knew what that meant. Reports. Investigations. Questions. Everything coming to the surface. Yes, I said finally. We follow protocol. She nodded and stepped away. And just like that, it began. I looked back at Emily. Her face looked different like this. Softer. Stripped of the confidence she used to wear so easily. For the first time in a long time, she looked human to me. Not untouchable. Not protected. Just breakable. A slight movement caught my attention. Her fingers twitched. Then again, I leaned in closer. Emily. Her breathing shifted. Uneven. Struggling. Slowly, her eyes fluttered open. Not fully. Not clear. But enough. She looked at me. And for a second, she didn't recognize me. Then something changed. Confusion turned into something sharper. Fear. Not relief. Not comfort. Fear. It's me, I said quietly. Natalie. Her body tensed weakly. Like even that small movement took everything she had. Tears filled her eyes almost instantly. Her lips parted. But no sound came out. Don't try to talk, I said automatically. But she tried anyway. Her voice was barely there. Broken. Air more than sound. Wasn't, she whispered. I leaned closer. Instinct taking over. What? Her fingers moved. Searching. Until they found my wrist. Weak, but urgent. Wasn't me. The words hit harder than anything she could have said. I froze. What do you mean? I asked. My voice lower now. Her breath hitched. They made me. Everything inside me went still. They. I repeated. Who? Emily. Her grip tightened just slightly. Uncle. The word came out fractured. Barely there. But I heard it. Clear enough. Daniel. The name dropped into the room like something heavy. And suddenly, everything made sense in a way I didn't want it to. The hallway. The silence. The watching. 10 years ago. I saw it again in my head, Uncle Daniel standing at the top of the stairs. Saying nothing while everything fell apart. Watching. Just watching. Emily, I said. Sharper now. What are you talking about? What did he make you do? Her eyes squeezed shut. Pain flashing across her face. I tried. Her voice broke completely. Fix it. Fix it. The words echoed. Fix what? What had she done? What had she been forced to do? And how much of it had been a lie? And how much had been something worse? Stay with me, I said. But this time it wasn't clinical. It was something else. Something I didn't want to name. Her grip on my wrist weakened. Her breathing became more erratic. Doctor, a nurse said quickly, stepping forward. Her vitals. I see it, I snapped. Already moving. The moment shattered. Medication. Adjustments. Commands. Her eyes closed again before she could say anything more. Before I could ask anything else. And just like that, the truth slipped out of reach again. I stepped back slowly as the team stabilized her. Alive. Still. But silent again. I looked down at her. My mind racing now in a way it hadn't all night. She hadn't denied it. She hadn't defended herself. She had said it wasn't her. She had said they made her. And she had said his name. Daniel. Behind me. The machines continued their steady rhythm. But everything inside me had changed. Because this wasn't just about what happened 10 years ago anymore. This was about something that had been controlled, manipulated, built. And if what she said was true, then the person who destroyed my life was never the one I thought it was. I turned toward the door, my thoughts already moving ahead. There were 2 Daniels in this story, one from the past, one standing outside right now. And for the first time, I was starting to believe they were connected. And if they were, then this wasn't over. Not even close. Her vitals started dropping again just before midnight. It wasn't sudden this time. It was slower, more dangerous. The kind of decline that doesn't give you a clean moment to react. BP is falling, the nurse said, her voice tight. I was already moving. Get me labs. Full panel. Prep OR again. Now. The room shifted instantly. Controlled urgency snapping back into place. No hesitation. No delay. But this time, it felt heavier. Because now I knew, this wasn't just trauma. This was damage layered over time. Poison working its way through her system. Weakening everything until her body couldn't fight anymore. And if we didn't act now, she wouldn't survive long enough to tell me the rest. I stood at the edge of her bed for half a second longer than necessary. Just 1 second. That was all it took for the thought to come. I could walk away. No one would question it. Her condition was already critical. Complications were expected. Outcomes uncertain. If she didn't make it through this, the truth would die with her. And everything she took from me, everything I lost, would stay buried. Doctor, the nurse's voice pulled me back. I looked down at Emily, at the person who had stood in that living room and watched my world collapse. At the person who had just whispered that she wasn't the one in control. My jaw tightened. She took everything from you. A quiet voice in my head said, but another one answered just as quickly. And you're not that person anymore. I exhaled slowly. We're taking her back in, I said. Firm. Final. No hesitation left. The team moved fast. Within minutes, we were back under the surgical lights. The room closed in again, familiar and sharp. This was where decisions were made. This was where outcomes changed. I scrubbed in, the water running over my hands as my thoughts settled into something clearer. I wasn't doing this for my parents. I wasn't doing this to fix the past. And I wasn't even doing it for her. I was doing it because this was who I had become. And no one was taking that from me. Let's go, I said, stepping into position. The procedure started harder than the first. Her body was weaker now. Systems strained. Margins thinner. Compensations failing. Someone said, I see it. Adjust here. I worked fast. Precise. Every movement intentional. No wasted motion. No room for doubt. Halfway through, everything went wrong. Heart rate dropping. Stay with it, I snapped. Do not lose that line. The monitor screamed. For a second, it almost flatlined. The room held its breath. Charge. Ready? Clear. The shock hit. Her body jolted. Nothing. Then, a flicker. A beat. Another. Small. Fragile. But there. We've got something, the nurse said, relief breaking through her voice. Keep going, I said, because we weren't done. Not yet. Minutes stretched. The kind that felt like hours. Every second balanced on the edge of losing her. I didn't think about the past anymore. Didn't think about what she had done. Or what had been done to her. There was only this. This moment. This decision. and I held it steady. Slowly, gradually. Her vitals stabilized. Not strong. Not safe. But alive. I stepped back just slightly, watching the monitor as it settled into a fragile rhythm. She made it. Again. I removed my gloves. The tension in my shoulders finally loosening just a fraction. Not relief, just completion. As I stepped out of the OR, the hallway felt different this time. Heavier. Because now, I wasn't just the doctor who saved her. I was the one holding the truth. My parents were still there. And so was him. Daniel Carter. They all turned the moment I walked out. "What happened?" my father asked, stepping forward. "Is she okay?" my mother added, her voice breaking. I looked at them. Really looked. Then I spoke. "She's alive." Relief hit them instantly. Visible. Immediate. But it didn't last. Because I didn't stop there. She was poisoned. The silence that followed was absolute. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father went completely still. Behind them, Daniel's expression didn't change fast enough. Just for a second. It cracked. "That's not possible," he said quickly. "There has to be some mistake." I turned to him. "There isn't." My voice stayed calm. Controlled. Unshakable. This wasn't an accident. The words landed harder this time. My father looked between us. Confusion turning into something sharper. "What are you saying?" he demanded. "I'm saying," I continued. "Someone had access to her. Over time. I let that sit. Then I looked directly at Daniel. And didn't look away. He held my gaze. For a moment. Then he smiled. Small. Tight. "You're overstepping," he said. "You're too close to this." There it was. Control the narrative. Discredit the voice. I didn't argue. Didn't defend. I simply said, "It's already been reported." That changed everything. Because now it wasn't personal anymore. It was official. Unavoidable. My parents looked at me again. Different this time. Not certain. Not dismissive. Just unsure. For the first time in my life, they didn't know who to believe. And I didn't help them. I didn't explain. I didn't soften. I just turned to leave. "I saved her because I could," I said quietly. I paused, then added, without looking back. "But what happens next isn't up to you anymore." The hospital felt different in the morning. Quieter. Softer. Like everything that had happened overnight was being held in place by something fragile. Something temporary. But nothing inside me felt calm. I stood outside the ICU room for a moment before stepping in, my hand resting briefly on the door like I needed that second to steady myself. Emily was awake. Not fully. Not strong. But conscious. Her eyes shifted toward me as I entered. Slower this time. More aware. For a second, neither of us spoke. There was no version of this moment that felt simple. No easy apology. No clean forgiveness. Just truth waiting. "How are you feeling?" I asked, keeping my voice even. She let out a weak breath that might have been a laugh. "Like I shouldn't be alive," she whispered. I didn't respond to that. Because she wasn't wrong. I stepped closer, checking her vitals out of habit more than necessity. "Stable. For now." "You said something last night," I said quietly. "Before you lost consciousness." Her expression shifted. Fear. Then something else. Relief. "I know," she said. Her voice trembled. But she didn't look away this time. "I don't have a lot of time before they start asking questions," she continued. "So you need to hear this." I didn't interrupt. I didn't move. I just listened. "It wasn't supposed to go that far," she said. Her words slow. "Careful. Back then, with the money, I found something. Same thing you did." My chest tightened. "I went to him," she continued. "I thought he'd fix it. Protect the company. Protect the family. Uncle Daniel. I already knew. He didn't fix it," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "He told me to stay quiet. Said if it came out, then everything would collapse. The business. Dad. Mom. Everything they cared about. I stayed still, but every word hit harder than the last. So you lied, I said. She closed her eyes. I thought it would be temporary, she whispered. I thought I could fix it later, that I could undo it. But you didn't, I said. No, she admitted, because he didn't let me. Her fingers tightened weakly around the blanket. He controlled everything after that. The accounts, the records, me. The room felt smaller. He said if I ever told the truth, he'd make sure it all came back on me. Or worse, on them. My parents. Of course. They didn't just believe me, she said, her voice cracking. They needed to. I let that sit. Because that part, I already understood. And now, I asked. She swallowed. I tried to get out, she said. A few months ago. I started pulling records again, looking for a way to prove it. My eyes narrowed slightly. And Daniel? I asked. Her expression changed again, different this time. He found out, she said. The silence that followed was heavy. He started controlling everything, she continued. What I ate, what I took. He said it was for stress, for my health. But it wasn't. We both knew that now. I didn't realize at first, she said. Not until it was too late. Her voice dropped. I think he thought I wouldn't make it. I exhaled slowly. So this was it. Not just one man. Not just one lie. A chain. Years long. Built on silence. Built on fear. Built on the fact that no one ever questioned anything. I looked at her. At the sister I had hated for 10 years. And for the first time, I saw her clearly. Not innocent. But not in control either. You should have told me, I said quietly. Tears slipped down her temples. I know, she whispered. We stayed like that for a moment. No yelling. No dramatic reconciliation. Just truth. Finally where it should have been. A knock at the door broke the silence. A nurse stepped in, glancing between us. Hospital administration is here, she said. And authorities? Of course they were. I nodded once. I'll be right out. She left. Emily looked at me again. What happens now? She asked. I held her gaze. The truth, I said. And this time, I meant it. When I stepped out into the hallway, my parents were already there. But they didn't rush toward me. They didn't speak right away. They just looked at me, like they were seeing someone new. Or maybe someone they should have seen all along. We know, my father said finally, his voice lower than I had ever heard it. I didn't ask how. It didn't matter. My mother stepped forward slightly, her hands trembling. We were wrong, she said. Simple. Direct. Too late. I let the words sit between us. Then I nodded once. Not forgiveness. Just acknowledgement. You didn't ask, I said quietly. Her face broke. I know, she whispered. I tried to tell you, I continued, and you didn't want to hear it. I was afraid, she said, tears slipping down her face. I know, I said, and I did. That was the difference now. I understood, but that didn't erase anything. My father took a step closer. Come home, he said. We can fix this. I almost smiled. Almost. You can't fix 10 years, I said. Silence. We can try, he insisted. I shook my head. I'm not coming back, I said. The words were calm, certain, not angry. And somehow that made them heavier. My mother's shoulders dropped. Like something inside her finally gave way. But are we, she started, unable to finish. I didn't let her struggle for it. We're not nothing, I said. That was the truth. But it wasn't everything either. If there's anything left, I added, it has to be built differently. Not the same house. Not the same rules. Not the same silence. They nodded slowly. Because for the first time, they didn't get to decide how this worked. I did. Later, I walked out of the hospital alone. The morning air was cool, clean, quiet. For a moment, I just stood there, letting it settle. 10 years ago, I walked away with nothing. No family, no support, no voice. Today, I walked away with something else. Myself. I didn't get revenge the way people expect. No shouting. No destruction. No perfect ending. But I got something better. The truth came out. The power shifted. And I didn't have to lose myself to make it happen. I took a breath. Steady and deep. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. If you've ever been blamed for something you didn't do, if you've ever had people choose a version of the truth that erased you, tell me what you would have done. Would you have walked away like I did? Or stayed and fought to be heard? I read every comment. And your stories matter more than you think. And if this story stayed with you, if you believe that sometimes the strongest revenge isn't breaking someone else, but rebuilding yourself, stay with this channel. Because there are more stories like this one. And sometimes the truth takes time. But when it finally shows up, it changes everything.